What then transpired was that the CPU was initiated and the EMA was on site on the very day. And then after that, there was mobilization of equipment and materials to try and come and instigate the first phase of spillage response, which is the emergency response. So at that stage, you find that mobilization of equipment was done, and that phase is entirely, fixated with trying to minimize the extent of the spillage. So in that respect, what was first done, what we first did upon arrival, was to create a temporary dam upstream of the affected area to try and stop water from coming in and transporting more of the creosote downstream. So this river, Murare River, feeds into Odzi River, and Odzi River feeds into Save River. So the extent of the disaster could have been worse without that mitigation. After the creation of the temporary dam, it was followed by pumping out of the affected water. The creosote formed essentially three different layers, or it then created three different phases upon mixture with water. The first phase was the thin, was rather the buoyant oil that was sitting on top of the water, which is the one that was transported the furthest. And then we also had a miscible component of the creosote that led to discoloration of the water, which essentially formed into, or was transformed into, an emulsion of some sort. And then the third and most problematic layer was the coal tar itself, which is very dense and was sitting on the riverbed and flowing at its own terms under the influence of the flowing river. But because of the high concentration, you find that a lot of that coal tar then managed to seep underground and contaminated the riverbed to a depth of about 1.5 meters. So we pumped out the first two layers, which is the floating layer, the buoyant non-miscible layer, and then we then also pumped out the emulsion, and then the layer of coal tar that went into the riverbed was excavated mechanically. We received a lot of support from the ZCDC, the diamond mining company, which then also brought in equipment in the form of an excavator and in the form of two tipper trucks. The Environmental Management Agency had already availed our specialized hazmat emergency response vehicle, which is one of the only three in Africa at the time of its procurement. So having that equipment on site, it really managed to speed up the process of the decontamination. So we're saying that the first stage is emergency response for mitigation. The second stage is decontamination, where we are physically removing the contaminant from the contaminated media. So that then involved the pumping out of the contaminated water and the physical removal of the contaminated rocks and soils. So the water was pumped into makeshift evaporation pits, which were lined with high-density polyethylene to stop, any seepage into. Ultimately, that would lead to contamination of underground water. So the evaporation pits were constructed and they were fortified using the available equipment, and then the water was pumped from the sump, from the high concentration sump, into those pits. And then we also utilized existing pits that were, I think, made from processes of brick molding by the community, which were also lined, and then that's where the soils and the rocks were then dumped temporarily. So that then formed the second phase of the emergency response, or the spillage management. And then the last phase is the phase where we are now. And preceding that, we managed to slightly divert the river on its riverbed to try and channel it in a direction, or in a path that led to less concentration of creosote. So the evaporation ponds themselves, the anticipation is that from the monitoring that we've been doing now in the third phase, which involves the monitoring of the contaminated sites, the evaporation is going on well, and our anticipation is that on the onset of the rain season, the evaporation process would have been done, upon which we're going to excavate or carry out a process of removing the coal tar which is sitting at the bottom of the pits for disposal, probably through land farming, bioremediation, or incineration. So we are currently considering the appropriate method that we will use as indicated by the results of analysis. So the water quality itself, where we are now, the problematic parameter particularly was the chemical oxygen demand, the COD, and the biological oxygen demand, or what we in turn call the dissolved oxygen. Why is it important? Aquatic life, essentially, it relies on the dissolved oxygen that is residing in the water itself